Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the Bipartisan Policy Center for Is the Republican Party Becoming the Party of Populism? I'm Jason Fichtner, Chief Economist here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. The Democratic Party is often seen as the party of the working class, while the Republican Party is traditionally known for supporting free markets, free trade, limited government, balanced budgets, tax cuts, and pro-growth economic policies. However, the Republican Party is increasingly gaining more of the working class vote. Some conservatives are now supporting populist issues that used to be the domain of the Democratic Party. What's causing this shift in the Republican Party? Is the Republican Party fracturing between traditional conservatives and newer pro-labor conservatives? Or is this just an evolution of how we are thinking about what is good for politics and an automatic shifting in the debate as societies change and mature? Joining me today is Oren Cass. Oren Cass is the Executive Director of American Compass and the author of The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America. He is a contributing opinion writer for the Financial Times, and his work also appears regularly in publications including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Also joining me today is Warren Payne. Warren is a fellow here at the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Program. However, his day job is as a senior advisor in Mayor Brown's office, Washington, D.C. office, and a member of the Tax, Public Policy, Regulatory, and Political Law International Trade Practices. He joined Mayor Brown from the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Ways and Means, where he held a number of staff leadership roles from 2007 to 2015, including as policy director. He helps us here at the BPC, working through a lot of issues on economic policy, tax issues, and trade policies. So, gentlemen, welcome. I appreciate you all being here, you both being here today.
Good to be here.
Thank you. So let's start this off. Oren, ask you to go first. We're seeing a lot of issues going on now with traditional Republican Party and issues about populism, some attacks on basically corporate interest, attacks on trade policies, balanced budgets, support for maybe even like limited improvements and increases to wages and the minimum wage. These are traditionally not conservative issues. They seem more populist. So I would ask you sort of what's going on here?
Well, I think, without being pedantic, there's actually some important definitional issues that feed into this. Certainly one is the question of what we mean by populist. I think sometimes we slip into populist to just mean something that's popular, and in that respect, everyone, of course, all politicians are populists. I think what we're really getting at when we talk about the populism going on in the GOP is a real shift in whose interests and opinions matter, away from a focus on the elite views that you would hear, say, on Wall Street, and toward the concerns of your typical working family. And that then connects with, I think, the second question, which is, what do we mean by traditional, either Republican or conservative? In the past few decades, we've come to think, as you said in the intro, conservative economics just means tax cuts, free trade, deregulation, maybe union busting. That's not actually the history of the Republican Party, and it's not necessarily conservative at all. I mean, the Republican Party was the party of tariffs, certainly up until World War II. And even, Nixon had a global 10% tariff at one point, and Reagan had a number of very protectionist policies. And so, I think what you're seeing is more the expiration of this quite anachronistic coalition that formed on the right of center, where conservatives partnered with libertarians, and the libertarians got to do all of the economic policy. And that has not worked especially well either for the economy or for conservatives. And I think a lot of what you're seeing now is a shift away from that, with genuine conservative thinking coming back to the forefront, and that rightly focuses a lot more on what the typical working family needs than on what the typical hedge fund needs.
Oren, what's your initial thoughts on this? Because we start thinking about, again, traditional conservatism. And again, I think Oren's right to point out what we mean by typical, the terminology and the nomenclature. But we've talked about, Republicans have always been about family values too, but there's also been that business interest in pro-growth, and a rising tide can lift all boats. Business interests are good for the country, innovation, free trade, protection of personal property, that's how we get to a better America. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think Oren has some really important kind of foundational points, though. Like if you look at the history of the Republican Party, um, there are plenty of places where kind of historically the Republican Party has had, for lack of a better term, we'll call the quote unquote populist mantle. Ronald Reagan had the great saying, Wall Street, the stock market is not the real economy. It had Richard Nixon with a negative income tax proposal. I think the difference here starts with the Republican approach on trade. And I think the Republican approach on trade is a great microcosm for where the pendulum is swinging. Republicans, at least, have been, to Oren's point, post-World War II, largely for more trade liberalization. But that hasn't been only a Republican thing either, right? The GATT negotiations were called the Kennedy round for a reason. So what we're seeing is, I think, a bigger shift among both parties. I think the Democrats have made the transition faster than Republicans on trade, but both parties are trending in the same direction. And that's largely a reaction to the impact of China coming into the global trading economy. A lot of trade policy that we saw developed in the 90s and early 2000s was predicated on a number of assumptions about what would happen when China integrated into the global economy that, quite frankly, were wrong, right? People drastically underestimated the impact of China entering the global economy in a big way and what the impact would be on U.S. workers, U.S. competitiveness, U.S. innovation. And so as a result, we're having to rethink all of those assumptions. As we rethink those assumptions on trade, they have ripple effects across other aspects of policymaking, on job training, on education, on workforce issues, on economic support. And so we are seeing a kind of rethink of some of those assumptions, not from my perspective because it's some great fracture or change from historical Republican viewpoints, because we're reacting to a changing global environment.
So maybe this is a good, you brought up free trade, and I think I want to dive into some of our policy issues and see where there might be some like agreement, disagreement, and where things are moving. And so, for example, Oren, on free trade, you recently on Twitter were commenting on someone who's putting out a proposal for reinvigorating, chips. So it's called the chip makers visa. And one of the things you said is you'd support something like this if we got away from the bankruptcy of quote unquote free trade ideology and its dogma of comparative advantage. And as an economist, I was like, no, you can't take away the basic fundamental truths of economics from me. I mean, I was brought up that the comparative advantage is something that makes this all work. I mean, the reason I can't farm, I can't build a house, I can't repair my car on my own, I'm horrible at it. But the fact that someone pays me to think, research, talk, have conversations like this allows me then to get an income and money that then goes out and allows me to hire people to do the things that they can do best so they can make a living and so on. That's how the economy works. And that's been, again, that fundamental theory behind free trade for so long. So why is that now dogma? Why is that shifting in the conversation?
Well, I think, comparative advantage as an abstract theory on a whiteboard is fine. It does not work very well at all in the modern economy and in the modern global economy in particular. And the reason for that is that the things that we're trading between countries look nothing like the kind of specialization you're describing in your individual life. Comparative advantage, when you're thinking about the actual natural endowments that vary from country to country, makes a lot of sense. You trade the natural resources you have, the things you can grow, for the things that other countries have and can grow. Let's talk about semiconductors. What does it even mean to have comparative advantage in semiconductors? And what does it mean to say that Taiwan and South Korea, but not the United States, has the comparative advantage in semiconductors? That's not something that was discovered. That's some feature of a rocky outcropping in the Western Pacific. It's a function of government policy. It is something that they created. And while those countries were really focused on important technologies like chips, the United States had economists who said, well, comparative advantage works, and it doesn't matter what we make or even whether we make anything. And the consequence of that was that high value manufacturing, like semiconductor fabrication, all of which was developed in the United States, left for the other side of the Pacific. And why I think that example of the CHIPS visa is so interesting and telling is there's no coherent narrative in economics where we should need a CHIPS visa. The semiconductor industry is an American invention. We still have the leading design firms. How can it be that we don't have people who know how to build and operate chip fabrication facilities? It's a function of bad trade policy. And so as we make these adaptations, I think, Warren spoke well about how everyone's realizing these assumptions just were not correct. This is not how the international economy operates. And it really requires, I think, a concession that what the economists said was simply wrong. And this is exactly why I say populism properly understood is very much needed, frankly, in both political parties, but certainly in the GOP, where anything an economist said was taken as sort of thou shalt dogma for policymakers. And a lot of times it was very bad advice.
I think I need to put on my dismal scientist, economist hat here for this discussion. But Warren, before I go to you, I want to just ask a question. And maybe, Oren, you brought something up. The comparative advantage sort of model that we're sort of all taught in school as Econ 101 sort of seems to work potentially in a closed economy, right? So, for example, if you take Detroit and Iowa, there's no difference whether you grow corn in Iowa or raise it as an automobile in Detroit, as long as you have comparative advantage and you can trade. But to your point now, you've got an international global economy in which the rules and regulations and the conditions have changed based on government intervention as opposed to government hands-off. Is that part of the major difference as well? Is it really government policy we should be focusing on as opposed to whether we have a comparative advantage or not? Is that the distinction?
So, I'm sorry. You want Warren to go first or me?
I wonder if you can just do a quick on that, and then I'll let Warren pull it all in. I'm sure he's got a lot to add on this.
Well, I don't think the open economy versus closed economy distinction saves us at all. I think comparative advantage is typically taught in the open economy context. The whole premise is it's a justification for international trade. So, I certainly don't think we should hide. we should hide behind, well, maybe comparative advantage just doesn't work when it comes to international trade. The issue is that comparative advantage doesn't work when you have different countries investing to essentially capture the most valuable industries. And if you have, particularly China being the 800-pound gorilla in a lot of these competitions, pursuing this state-owned mercantilist approach, and the U.S. says, that's fine, we'll just sort of take whatever's left over, it goes very badly. And American workers were screaming for 20 years, this is going very badly. And economists said, no, you don't understand economics, it's working great. And looking outside the window a little more than at the blackboard, I think is helpful.
Warren, a lot there for you to chew on.
I think there's some good points there, and I do think. Listen, fundamentally, I do believe we are better off trading than not trading. Right? There is a net benefit overall. The issue is, I think, the point Oren was making is, you can also have a policy tragedy of the commons, which is if some actors are behaving and assuming a certain set of rules of the road, rules of trade, and other actors are assuming very different, much more mercantilist, predatory rules of the road, that's not going to work because those are two different systems. They don't interact, they don't mesh. One ends up taking advantage of the other. And I think to a large extent, what Oren is talking about is that interaction, where we've had certain economies, notably China, have a different approach to, trade and international economic cooperation that is much more predatory, much more mercantilist than the United States and a number of other Western countries. So it is an issue where that kind of irreconcilably different approach requires a rethink and requires a different set of policy levers to be engaged. And on a policy lever specifically, I would note two things. One is it's not just as much a proactive, hey, are we going to subsidize? Or are we going to incentivize? Part of it's, are we also going to get out of the way? I mean, if you talk to people trying to actually put a new factory somewhere in the United States, the amount of red tape, permitting, regulatory barriers they face is tremendous. And so that kind of policy environment is a disincentive, and it pushes people to move their plants somewhere else where they don't have to deal with those kinds of regulatory barriers. The other is what we're seeing now is because we had this distinction for so many years, we lost so many industries to these predatory actions, we're having to go back and make up for lost ground. And unfortunately, it may be that the only way you can successfully make up for some of this lost ground is to take what quote unquote populist economic policies and put government money into it, put government incentives into it, because we've lost that and we have to recreate that. The private sector is not capable of doing that because we've lost that part of the private sector. We have to find a way to incubate that part of the private sector to bring it back, and then hopefully turn it over to the private sector and get back out of the way.
So let me ask you, Warren, to sort of just to reiterate something. You're basically saying that we've lost something in the private sector, its ability to compete in some ways, and the government does have a role to intercede and help out and subsidize to get it kicked back up and started again?
I think there are probably examples where that is true. There have to be places where, listen, I would argue it's the government's fault that we lost some of these industries because we stood on the sideline and let China and others engage in predatory actions, right? And so when that part of the economy is gone and there is no private sector actor, or certainly no private sector actor of sufficient scale, something has to be done to nurture that back into place in order to get to scale where they can be competitive internationally, as long as the U.S. ensures a level playing field, and then the government gets out of the way and lets the private sector go back to doing their thing.
For the audience, there is a way for you to ask questions of our panelists online. Just please enter questions in the chat, and hopefully I'll see them and can ask them along the way if appropriate. I want to talk about a couple of interesting policy areas that have been up for debate between this sort of, are we being populist, are we losing our traditional roots? And the next one I want to go to is sort of immigration. And Oren, I'll turn to you. And I won't put any sort of context on this. I'll just sort of say is, what should the Republican Party, or the new Republican Party, or however it's going, what should its stance be on immigration and why?
Well, I think it has to start with enforcement and getting our immigration system under control. That I'm not sure why that would be a Republican or conservative priority. At this point, I think it's common sense that we are reaching a level of crisis and policy created crisis that is foreclosing any prospect of a functional immigration system at all. So the prerequisite here has to be the United States establishing certainly that we have the right and capacity to control our borders, and then actually enforcing our laws. When you do that, and this is where I think you see a really interesting and arguably populist shift on the right of center, you have to have a point of view on what sort of labor market you want. And you see a really interesting tension between a business community that's always asking for more and cheaper labor. There's always a labor shortage. They can never find enough of the workers they need, and they see immigration as a response. And then the interests of workers, which is to have a tight labor market and to recognize that actually for capitalism to work and prosperity to be spread broadly, it's really important that workers have some power, and that capital have no choice but to use and negotiate with the workers that are here. And so I think this is a place where you've seen a really significant shift within the right of center already, as it moves away from just buying into this idea that whatever is good for earnings per share will ultimately be good for everybody, and focusing instead on the idea that a tight labor market and worker power are good things, and therefore mandatory verify, ultimately lower levels of immigration, particularly at the low skill level where we have a softer labor market, and lower wages, that those are critical things and have to be part of the economic formula.
So before I turn to Warren for his thoughts on this, I want to make sure I clarify something. So in some ways, what you're arguing for is that immigration should be in some way based on the labor market and the conditions of supply and demand that we need in this country. So if you basically have a surplus of lower wage workers, you wouldn't want to have more immigration in the area. But if we had a deficit, you'd want more. Same thing when it comes to skill-based high-tech areas. If we have a deficit, you'd want to allow immigration higher in those areas to sort of balance out the labor market. Is that correct?
Well, I would reject the idea that you can have a surplus or deficit of workers in some segment of the labor market. I mean, the whole premise of supply and demand is that you find the equilibrium point. And what we've done is said every time you actually see pressure at that low end of the labor market to actually improve conditions, raise wages, invest in workers, we declare somehow, well, that's a deficit or a labor shortage, and we need to bring more workers in. And that's just wrong. That's not market friendly at all. This is a time when markets actually can work and work to the advantage of workers. So I think what we need to look at is the actual conditions in the labor market, the kinds of jobs that we're offering. And, something we do a lot of research on at American Compass is looking at, sure, you can count hundreds of thousands of jobs created a month, but what are the actual characteristics of those jobs? If you survey workers and ask them about the characteristics of their jobs, and we've set a very low threshold for what we call a secure job, it's just earnings of at least $40,000 a year, health benefits and paid time off, and some future-looking certainty in your forward-looking earnings and what your schedule is going to be. These are not outrageous demands. Only about 40% of the jobs in our economy meet that definition. And for people without a college degree, it's only 30%. So the question is, why aren't employers creating the kinds of jobs that are actually going to be secure jobs and allow people to support our family or support their families? And to the extent that we have an immigration system that enables and empowers the creation of bad jobs, that's a disaster. We need to make it so that the imperative is to create better jobs for people.
So Warren, you get sort of two cracks at this. One is immigration policy in general, and I do want you to comment on Warren's thought about the labor market sort of aspects of this.
Listen, I think they're largely heavily integrated, almost the same question. Listen, I'm going to start with agreeing with Warren that the crisis at the border has to be addressed before policymakers will have any kind of political space to have a debate about what and how we do with legal immigration policy. There's just not the policies and political space available to have that discussion in the current environment. But assuming when and if that is addressed, then I think we can have a very robust debate about what a good legal immigration policy is. Listen, we have an aging workforce. There's no doubt about it. Labor participation rates are down. There's a number of reasons for them, but a significant contributing cause is the aging of the labor force. We have a labor force where the surveys for the younger workers indicate pretty radically different preferences of what they want out of their job than what our generation, or certainly our parents' generation, expected out of their job. How many, you talk to any 20-year-old right now, how many of them anticipate they're going to be at the same job for 40 years? And it's not just whether or not that's actually going to happen, but whether that's a desired outcome that they seek. I think there's a lot of surveys and analysis that indicates that's not what they want. They want more flexibility. They want a kind of the a la carte approach to employment that's very different from the kind of approach to labor policy and employment policy that's been, quite frankly, the norm for decades, where you have a job and you hold that job for 10, 20, 30 years. So we have both the aging of the labor force and drastic changes in what the younger generations want out of their labor force participation that need to be reconciled. I think that is a churn that's happening now. I'm not entirely sure how it's going to play out, but I do think there is a role for legal immigration as part of the solution set there. Because, to Oren's point, how many of that, what do they want out of jobs? Listen, I've got teenagers. None of my teenagers are ever going to be farm labor, even if I wanted them to. That's just not where they're seeking employment. That doesn't mean we don't need farm labor. We still need farm labor because we still have to grow food. So those discrepancies need to be reconciled. And the last thing I would say is, particularly at the lower end of the income spectrum, it's not necessarily a question of just, hey, we're going to raise wages to the point where we attract people to do those jobs. We're also seeing automation, and particularly in the service sector, that's going to radically remake exactly how, particularly, I think, the lower end of the labor market is going to operate. You go into almost any fast casual restaurant right now, they probably have drastically reduced wait staff than they did 10 years ago, because everybody's got a little kiosk on the table you use to facilitate, your ordering. So those things to me are all part of a much broader debate about the transitions that are happening in the labor market. And some of them are pretty fundamental and require us to have an approach different than how we've approached it for 10, 20, 30, 40 years before.
Well, Oren, anything to add to that before I move to the next sort of topic, or does that generally jive with you? Would you clarify anything or add anything different?
Well, I mean, I guess I would pick up on one point, which I agree with Warren about a lot of these trends underway, but they seem to cut in some quite different directions. I mean, greater automation would be terrific. We are in an era of stagnating productivity in the United States, which is a big part of the reason we also see wage stagnation. If we're actually seeing and expecting high levels of automation in lower skilled jobs, that's fantastic news. That means we don't need as many of those workers, and those who are in those jobs will be doing better, more productive jobs and can be paid more. And if you sort of push that, to the extreme, I think the farm worker example is incredibly telling. We have made a policy choice that farm jobs should be bad jobs. When we say that they're jobs Americans won't do, or Warren says, those aren't what his kids want to do. Well, no kidding. When you offer the farms, temporary migrant labor at minimum wage or below, those are going to be lousy jobs. But you look over in California, and you've got in San Francisco, we coddle software developers with every perk we can think of under the sun, and we just assume that that's part and parcel of the job of being a software developer. And then we say, well, farm workers, you have to, sit in a dusty field for $14 an hour. If we ask the software developers to sit in a dusty field for $14 an hour, my guess is you wouldn't find many of those either. And the reason I'm going down this path and connecting it to the immigration point is that our entire model of immigration is to relieve people of having businesses and higher income households who employ a lot of low wage labor, relieve them of actually having to think about what it would take to offer good jobs. And so, yes, let's get more automation. Let's get way more automation in agriculture. Think of how much better farm jobs could be if they were heavily automated, and if the incentive was to make them much more capital intensive. But what we should not do is say, wow, look at all these changes, look at everything that's in flux. Let's be sure to bring in a lot of immigrant labor so that constraint on workers isn't something that is influencing people's decisions. We want a strong constraint on labor to be exactly what's influencing capital's decisions, so that as all of these things evolve, they do evolve in ways that are good for workers.
I want to move to a question, and Warren, I'm going to ask you first, but Oren, don't go away yet. We are getting a few questions, and one question, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Currently, what proportion of Republicans in power, so think congressional, for example, or governors, what proportion do you think today favor regulation and oppose free trade, favor regulation, oppose free trade versus promoting free trade and opposing regulation in general? What's the shift, and where do you see it go? We 50-50, 60-40, what would you say? If you had to guess.
I guess I'm going to actually disagree with the question a little bit, to be fair, because particularly on the trade front, certainly among the GOP, and I think also among the Democratic side of the aisle, we have entered a realm where there are almost two distinct and parallel views of trade policy. There is a trade policy as it relates to U.S.-China economic engagement, and there is trade policy with U.S. economic engagement with almost everyone else. Everyone, the vast majority of members, both sides of the aisle, quite frankly, are extremely hawkish on U.S.-China economic and trade policy. It's a question of whether you're a decoupler or a de-risker, right? That's the debate. That is, I would argue, that is not the case vis-a-vis other countries. You see strong bipartisan support for pushing the current administration to finish the free trade negotiations that were started by the Trump administration with the UK and Kenya, for example. You see strong bipartisan pressure on the administration for its lack of ambition in the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum negotiations. So I would say, listen, on China, it's overwhelmingly hawkish, air quotes, protectionist, whatever you want to describe it. Everyone else, much more nuanced, open to economic integration, cooperation, and trade.
Oren, would you generally agree with that or different opinion?
Yeah, I think that's generally right. China is certainly its own issue, although I would say maybe I see a broader range of views on China. I think the sort of de-risking, decoupling vocabulary has in some ways become an opportunity for people to try to sound like they're being serious while doing as little as possible. And that's particularly true in the Biden administration, where they've embraced what they're calling de-risking, and what you'll hear someone like Jake Sullivan talk about is what he calls, small yard, high fence, to suggest that there's sort of, for national security reasons, a very limited set of technologies that the US needs to protect, but that other than that, we should be pursuing tight economic integration. And you hear Janet Yellen still, frankly, she sounds like it's 2000 a lot of the time with the way she talks about it. So, I think certainly in the Democratic Party and then in the Republican Party with those vestiges of it that are still sort of eating the Wall Street Journal editorial page for breakfast every morning, there's an effort to sort of rhetorically sound on side and hawkish on China, while in fact doing as little as possible to actually disrupt economic relationships, all the way over to the other extreme, a real focus on essentially doing everything we can to force the countries apart in their economic relationship. And, a great example of this is, I don't even remember what the bill was recently that Senator Hawley introduced as an amendment, 25% across the board tariff on Chinese goods. And I think it got something like 18 Republican votes. And so that sort of gives you a sense of what the other what the other boundary of the opinion is. The one other thing I would say, just to your broader question about sort of what's going on in the coalition, particularly within the Republican Party, is I think you see a huge generational shift. In general, political leaders tend to be something of a lagging indicator of change in a party, because many of the senior leaders are those who were elected the longest time ago. And so I think you do see a lot of Republicans who, came into public office in the 90s, in the early 2000s, who are more set in the old way of thinking. But if you look at where most of the sort of momentum and energy within the party is, and I think the Senate is the best example of this, the younger leaders in the Senate, folks like Rubio, Hawley, Vance, Cotton, Todd Young, Eric Schmidt now from Missouri, those folks I think are all very much down the path of recognizing that conservative economics needs to move on from what it might have looked like in 1980.
So, Oren, you just gave me a great segue to change back to labor policy. And so I'm going to do that and let Warren go first so he can answer. And then you get a chance, Oren, to sort of think about this, because you mentioned some of the younger senators we have today. And there was an article in the New York Times just this past weekend, what Republicans say and don't say about the auto workers strike. And you had Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina saying, basically, I think Ronald Reagan gave us a great example when federal employees decided they were going to strike. As you guys recall, he fired them. That was the FAA strike. He fired the federal workers. Now you go to today, where the UAW is striking, and this gets in the question of, is the Republican Party changing, and what does that mean? Josh Hawley, from Missouri, auto workers deserve a raise. and they deserve to have their jobs protected from Joe Biden's stupid climate mandates that are destroying the U.S. auto industry and making China rich. So one is promotion, basically, of the UAW and workers getting a raise, but also then attacking China and Biden policy, where Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio wrote, and it was quoted in the Times, rooting for the auto workers across our country, demanding higher wages and an end to political leadership's green war on the industry. Marco Rubio, a radical climate agenda that seeks to end of gas-powered cars, even means destroying American jobs. So Warren, I think part of the question I have for you is the Republican Party changing in the sense of starting to support higher minimum wages, and to Oren's point, pointing out and trying to help workers? Or is this another way of basically trying to get votes from a party, from a population that the Republican Party needs, and trying to find a way to give them that support through language, but then attacking Biden policies and Democratic policies on the other hand?
I mean, listen, you have elected officials that need votes to get elected. So that's kind of a fundamental starting point, right? And you have seen, and we've talked about it over the course of this discussion so far, the ebbs and flows and changes in Republican Party posture on a whole range of issues, including labor policy over time. Listen, is it totally appropriate that workers are engaging in collective bargaining and there's a tension, there's a negotiation? Of course, I would argue that's capitalism, right? That is actually what capitalism about. We're looking at supply, demand, who has negotiating leverage, who's using it. It's totally appropriate. And I think those members are acknowledging the appropriateness of that, while also recognize they're elected, they want to get elected, they need votes. And I think kind of fundamentally, I mean, there are questions about where all these different policies intersect. I did talk about kind of the impact of government policies that constrain the ability of industries to build, manufacturers to put a new plant in, to grow. And I think those are some of the things that have constrained the ability of the American workforce to kind of take that step and capture some of those better paying, higher wage jobs that Oren has talked about. Because quite frankly, if you can't put the new factory in with the fancy new equipment, the better automation that requires, someone with more education and training to operate in, because you can't get by the FDA or the EPA or some other regulatory agency, those jobs are going somewhere else. And so there are multiple issues here that all interact and have to be addressed, while also recognizing that an elected member of Congress, whether in the House or Senate, needs votes to get their job.
Oren, your thoughts?
I mostly agree with that. I think there's clearly been a significant shift in how, again, especially the next generation of Republican leaders thinks about the labor issue. Fundamentally, just recognizing that worker power is a good thing, and that a labor movement that actually allows workers to advance their interests, a little bit to Warren's point, this is sort of fundamental to capitalism. I mean, if you think about kind of what conservatives should want, they should want workers to have power and be able to negotiate raises so that you don't come back around and have to talk about redistribution. You should want workers to be able to agree on, workplace safety so that you don't need as much, you don't need OSHA doing as much. And so I think you see a real shift in thinking on that with someone like a Tim Scott or a Nikki Haley, mainly providing a reminder of how it used to sound. I mean, the bizarre thing about Senator Scott's comment is, of course, the president can't fire the auto workers. If I recall, someone tried to follow up with his campaign and say, hey, you do realize the difference between a private sector and public sector union, right? And they sort of they declined to clarify their comments. And so you're really seeing a changing of the guard in even just the ability to engage on and have thoughtful input on these kinds of issues. The one other thing I would just underscore, and you see this in connecting it back to the EV mandates and the Biden green agenda, is that part of what makes this such an interesting political opportunity is that as much as the Republican Party is shifting its focus toward workers, you also see the Democratic Party shifting away. In sort of generic rhetorical terms, you'll hear the Democratic Party talking about how they have a green agenda and this is going to be, be terrific and create lots of jobs. And as long as you're not actually doing anything yet, I guess you can say that. But the reality is that these things are in tension. And to the extent that the progressive priority is going to be the green agenda, to Warren's broader point about regulatory, interference with building things, to the extent that the progressive priority is going to be regulations that prevent you from building anything, then it actually is the Republican agenda that is a lot closer to workers' interests and even labor's interests. And so, what happens to the political valence of unions in the future, I think is in fact up for grabs.
So, Oren, you made a really interesting point, and I want to follow up and go to Warren on this. So we've been talking about whether the Republican Party is basically having a fracturing moment or a philosophical moment where they come to realization of rethinking the principles of markets, et cetera. But couldn't we also see something similar happening, as Oren said, in the Democratic Party? I mean, you could argue that moderate Democrats might view the progressive direction of the Democratic Party as, quote unquote, fracturing their party. I mean, again, I still remember the Bill Clinton days where the era of big government was over. And now it seems that both parties are interested in increasing the debt or deficit, and they might say differently, but the evidence is there. Is we seeing, to Oren's point, sort of a shift in this, what is the middle and what is Labor parties, and both parties, the Democratic and Republican Party, trying to go after them for votes?
So I'm going to be careful here because I'm not a Democrat. And so I hesitate to try to think like one and opine like one. But what I would observe is that there is plenty of tension in the public domain among different Democrat policymakers in the Democratic side of the aisle. One of the areas where I see that tension most acute is one we were literally just talking about, and that tension between the climate agenda and a labor or pro-manufacturing agenda. And you have seen this tension play out in a number of different examples just within the current term of the Biden administration. How the Biden administration deals with, for example, tariffs on imports of solar products, right? Here workers and their employee representatives petitioned the government, took advantage of existing trade laws that Congress enacted, a president signed into law, and the Biden administration, through a truly unprecedented action via just the issuance of an executive order, basically shut that whole thing down. And I can't imagine that didn't occur without some real serious debate and table pounding inside the administration. So certainly, just looking at what's out there in the public sphere, yeah, no shock, both parties have folks with different perspectives and different views that fit within the same spectrum that make them either a Democrat or a Republican.
Oren, do you want to elaborate? Because as we start talking about this, I keep thinking about things like student loans, where the Biden administration is trying to basically forgive student loans. And of course, people with student loans, whether Republican or Democrat, are like, hey, free money, I'll take it, sure. So maybe it's not a Republican-Democrat issue in that point. It's trying to go after an interest group issue, which goes back to the points you're both making about someone trying to get votes to get elected. And I think what I'm trying to sort through here for our audience is, where are we seeing changes in principles of the parties that go to then the policies, and where is it more just the traditional hardcore politicians needs votes and they go out and try to get them where they can get them to get enough to get elected?
Well, I think, the interest group force, particularly within the Democratic Party, seems just extraordinarily strong at the moment. And, Warren just, pointed out that the climate agenda is a piece of it. Of course, immigration is a huge piece of it. I mean, it is hard to make sense of why Democrats are doing what they're doing on immigration, even purely if all they wanted was just to get a lot of votes, let alone think about what would actually be good for American workers. And then, as you just alluded to, higher education is another area where you see the Democratic Party really doubling down. Student loan forgiveness, by the way, not paired with any actual reform in higher education that would prevent the same thing happening again. As in a sense, the core of the Biden agenda, right? If you were to sort of, I was saying at the beginning, traditionally you'd say conservative economics. Oh, that's tax cuts, free trade, deregulation, and maybe that's not necessarily conservative, and maybe it's changing. I think if you were to ask somebody, hey, what's the core Democratic Party agenda? It's climate change, immigration, higher higher education and this weird mix of extremely progressive social issues. And so, these things really come very sharply into conflict with the interests of your typical worker who doesn't have a college degree. And I really appreciate the point Warren was making. He's really highlighted two of the things that are in the way of building in America. There's both the sort of regulatory red tape and there's the skilled worker issue. And again, that's a place where sort of just plowing all of our resources into college doesn't get the job done at all. You see someone like Senator Cotton on the Republican side has a really interesting bill called the American Workforce Act that would create a very large subsidy, actually bigger than a Pell Grant, to support trainees on the job with companies, basically saying we should be funding a trainee who's getting on the job training at least as generously as we fund that student on the college campus. He actually funds it with new tax revenue, but the tax is an endowment tax. And again, historically, you would say, well, if you're sort of for the working class, then going after these tens of billions of dollars in college endowments would make sense. But you don't see any Democrats going anywhere near that sort of thing. And so, obviously I have my own opinion of which agenda I think is better. But just as a neutral matter, if you're describing the agendas of the two parties at this point and taking away our historic lens of what we assume each party stands for, I think pretty quickly recognize that the Democratic agenda looks like the wish list of a sort of college-educated, high-income, knowledge worker, fairly elite constituency, and the Republican Party increasingly looks like the agenda of your typical working family.
Warren, would you add anything more to that or your thoughts?
I think it's a good explanation in a nutshell of kind of what has historically been the core Republican policy views, which is economic growth, investment, and innovation. And I think what we're talking about are issues, nuances about how we achieve those three pillars, right? How do we best get to employment and wage growth, innovation, and investment? We've never walked away, the Republicans have never walked away from those things as kind of the core economic policy. Whereas, again, I hesitate to opine on kind of how Democrats see the world, but I think Orrin's point about some of the policies we're seeing are stifling towards achieving those goals, and you kind of wonder how much of that, what's driving that, and what kind of worldview pushes you to take those kinds of policy positions.
And I think this is a good segue to start talking about maybe tax policy a little bit, both on the corporate and the individual side. I mean, generally speaking, again, Orrin, to your point, the lens of history and the assumptions we would use looking at the lens of history would sort of categorize the Republican Party as being one of business, pro-corporations, pro-business, and the Democratic Party were a little bit more nuanced, but let's put it in the pro-labor camp. But now we're seeing, conservatives, Republicans come out and attack corporations, whether it's Google, Amazon, Governor DeSantis going after Disney, which I don't think is something I would have foreseen 10 years ago. Something's changing on that. And then, for a conservative who does tax policy, we understand that the first rule of taxes is that only people pay taxes. Corporations may write the check, but the instance is borne in some way by people, either in higher prices, return to capital, or lower return on wages. So wages go down. But now we're seeing both sides talk about corporations and what their taxes should be, what's a fair share. It seems like that even that part of the business interest of the Republican Party has been changing as well. And again, Warren and Orrin, you both maybe think about this as like the business of politics, right? Politics is a business. How do I get the votes to get in office? Is that just what we're seeing, or is again a fundamental shift in the principles and priorities based on what hasn't worked in the past and what we think might work in the future? Orrin, I'll ask you to go first.
Well, I really like the point that Warren just made about, at the end of the day, the focus still being on these same challenges of how do we get investment, how do we get innovation, how do we get the kind of growth that is going to lift all ships and translate to higher wages. And I think what you're seeing is maybe a broader thinking about what we mean by supply side economics. If you go all the way back to those Reagan tax cuts, the key transition was to recognize, hey, getting that investment and innovation and growth from the capital side is really important. It's not just the old Keynesian model of, making sure consumers can buy lots of stuff. And given what tax rates were in the late 70s, I mean, top individual rate was 70%, corporate and capital gains rates were between 40 and 50%. Dramatically reducing those rates was a really powerful way to encourage capital formation and investment and innovation. And I think what we're seeing now is if you make a list of what the problems in the 2020s are, what are the things that are preventing the kind of investment and innovation that we want, it's just not tax rates anymore. There are still obstacles, there are still things we could be doing better. And whether that is the trading relationship with China, whether that is how we, equip workers with skills, whether that is the sort of outright industrial policy to say, look, we just need to essentially subsidize the construction of semiconductor fabs. I mean, that's also supply side policy at the end of the day. And so I think what you're seeing is not a shift in the basic conservative commitment to wanting a free markets and a growing private sector economy. You're seeing a recognition that the stagflation of the 1970s isn't the same as the problems we have today. And so being a conservative means taking those conservative principles and solving today's problems, not just dusting off your 1980 playbook again.
Warren, what do you think? I see a smile.
I'm going to go back to the fundamental point that tax policy is about encouraging employment, investment, and innovation. How do we best do that? Part of this interacts very closely with trade policy as well, right? Because there's a global competition. We should expect other countries to enact policies that support their own national interests. And so we can't have a stagnant trade policy. We can't have a stagnant tax policy. They have to be flexible, they have to be reactive, and they have to adjust to changing global conditions. I think, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act made really fundamentally important changes to the tax code that help promote employment, investment, innovation, right? But things have happened since then. We have an entire international tax negotiation taking place under the auspices of the OECD and the G20 that is essentially creating new competitive pressures for U.S. businesses, U.S. employers, and U.S. workers. We have to be able to react to that because some of what's coming out of those negotiations are definitely about policies that other countries are pursuing because it will advantage their national interests, their economic interests over those of the United States. And so our tax policy has to be flexible and reactive enough to what is going on globally. And again, same thing with trade policy, same thing with all kinds of policies, because the world is not stagnant. The world changes. History has not ended. And so I think part of what we're doing today is having a debate about the fact that things change. Time passes. Conditions change. We have to react and change with them. And we shouldn't necessarily be surprised when that change happens. That change is good because it means we're reacting to new challenges, new conditions, new influences in the global economy, sometimes things we didn't think about, sometimes things we flat out got wrong, and we just have to react and make changes to address those things.
So we probably have time for two more general topics, and I want to hit one before finishing up on the last point. We are probably just a few days away from a government shutdown unless something miraculous happens on Capitol Hill. And I would say again, Oren, to your point about using a lens of history, the Republican Party conservatives like to talk a lot about deficit and debt and that they matter. And I think they've been, at least from a megaphone standpoint, voicing that concern. You could argue whether that they stand behind it because of tax cuts and not being deficit neutral. While the Democratic Party has been one more basically trying to raise taxes to be more deficit neutral, but still spending a lot, not necessarily covering it historically. But now we're seeing both parties seem very willing to just borrow money to paper over things. Should we, when thinking about Republicans and conservatives and what we do going forward as a party, should we be concerned about deficits and debt? It's kind of a short answer, but Oren, I'll ask you to go first.
Yes, I think absolutely. The structural deficits and the way they are contributing to ballooning debt is a huge problem and a threat ultimately to economic prosperity. I think that's just the one thing I would pick up on and connect to Warren's previous point about tax policy is for a long time now, the Republican Party's tax policy and the modeling you get from somewhere like the Tax Foundation just assumes that tax cuts are free. Right. The tax foundation models tax cuts and assumes that it doesn't matter that the deficit goes up because we'll just borrow more money from abroad. And of course, therefore, tax cuts always seem like they're great for the economy. Eliminating taxes altogether would be the best thing for growth and job creation. But we know that's not true. And so as we think about tax policy and as we think about fiscal policy generally, I think it's really important. And again, this goes back to sort of conservative economics, how conservatives should approach a well-functioning economy to recognize that having our fiscal house in order is an important part of that. And we need to get that right rather than just assume another tax cut is always somehow gonna make up for all our sins.
Warren?
I mean, listen, deficits and debts do matter. They probably matter more now in a high interest rate environment than they did before in a low interest rate environment where you had more policy flexibility. I think what's important here is, are we doing a real, thoughtful, sustainable approach to debt and deficit reduction? It's not something that can be solved overnight. And actually, if we were to try to solve it overnight, the economic impact on the economy and on workers and businesses would probably be way too disruptive than we would want to bear. I would note, if you look at the latest CBO forecast, CBO is forecasting revenues to be higher than the historical average and is forecasting discretionary spending to be lower than its historical average. And we still have rising debts and deficits. So I think we actually need to take a step back and look at, I think Warren used the term structural drivers of the deficits, what those are, and we can't ignore them. We can't paper over the fact that we have an aging population that's reducing labor force participation, which has an impact on economic growth and tax receipts. And it has an impact on the other side of the coin in terms of increased expenses for Social Security and Medicare and other social safety net programs. So those things have to be taken into account. And I think one really important part about how we approach deficit reduction is to look at those things that have been holding us back, and how do we address those barriers that have been holding back economic growth? How do we remove them and capture some of the benefits of higher economic growth? Kind of one statistic that has jumped out at me recently is the Congressional Budget Office did an analysis and said if labor force productivity was 0.5% higher than its baseline estimate, we would see the debt to GDP ratio cut by 50 percentage points. And we'd see a very significant increase in per capita GNP. Like, that's got to be at the core of how we're addressing a thoughtful long-term deficit reduction plan.
So I got to do a quick lightning round question for each of you to wrap this up. And Oren, I'll ask you to answer first. But, we all talk to our colleagues, our friends, are trying to have a pulse on the people both inside and outside the Beltway. And there does seem to be a sense of dissatisfaction with the Republican Party from what I would call traditional conservatives. And to your point, Oren, maybe even Democrats with some of their movement in their Democratic Party. So I guess the question I have in the lightning round answer, 30 seconds or less, do you think we're going to see the rise of a third party? A viable third party?
No.
Right. Warren?
History is not on the side of a third party.
So we're basically in a two-party system, and we better work to have it be the party we want it to be if you're affiliated with it. Is that kind of the answer I'm getting from you both?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think all of the incentives in our constitutional framework are for two parties, and parties go through these periods of transition. I mean, the Republican Party into the Reagan Revolution went through a tremendous transition. The Democrats then got absolutely smacked around for a while. Then they went through a transition. Now I think you're certainly seeing the Republicans going through that, and in a significant way, Biden. I think I recall back when he was running, he was supposed to be the transitional president, right? But he's really sort of the last of an old guard, and frankly, I look ahead at some of these newer leaders on the right of center. I'm very optimistic. Who comes next on the left of center, I'm less sure about, but it will surely be consequential.
Warren, last thought?
I think Oren's point about both parties having a long history and going through transitions is critical. We can't just analyze everything in the lens of the last 4 to 6 years. We have to look further back into history and look at how both parties have changed. And we've talked about that. Oren talked about how it wasn't that long ago that the Republican Party was quote unquote protectionist. I like to tell my Republican economist friends, Smoot and Hawley were both Republicans, right? So that kind of dynamic goes back to kind of the point I made in the last part of the conversation, which is the global economy is not static. History has not ended. Both parties, the economy as a whole, the American populace as a country has to continue to be dynamic and evolving in order to keep pace with everything else that's happening around us, much of which is completely outside of our control.
This has been a lot of fun and very insightful. Warren Payne, Oren Cass, gentlemen, thank you both for your time today. I'm Jason Fichtner, Chief Economist of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And for all of you that joined us, we appreciate your time and interest. Please tune in for more from the Bipartisan Policy Center going forward in the future. And again, Oren and Warren, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.